Hey guys, how's it going? I'm here for my first day of the Silmarillion buddy read. I'm buddy reading the Silmarillion with Alana McCready, and I'm really looking forward to all these videos we're going to be making. We have kind of a schedule put together of a certain specific number of chapters we're going to read per week. I think this buddy read will end up lasting about 8 weeks. Which is fine for me. I've read the Silmarillion like 3 times, so taking it slowly is totally cool for me, and I think the Silmarillion is a good book to read slowly. But anyway, so Silmarillion. I want to talk a bit about the background of the Silmarillion. So, it was published 4 years after Tolkien's death in 1977, But despite the fact that it was published after The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, it was actually the first thing that Tolkien first work of mythopoeia, as he called it, as sort of this invention of mythology that he ever worked on, long before he ever conceived of The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. He started working on it in his 20s, and sort of revised it throughout his whole life. He kept rewriting it, changing things majorly, sometimes not changing things so majorly, until he got to after he'd written The Hobbit. When he wrote The Hobbit, sort of elements of the Silmarillion snuck in. The Hobbit wasn't supposed to be related to the Silmarillion, but just through the process of writing, the little elements snuck in. But then when Tolkien was asked by his publisher to write a sequel to The Hobbit, he kind of at first hoped that maybe they would publish the Silmarillion, but the publisher read the manuscript and thought it wouldn't sell at all. And honestly, they weren't entirely to blame for being trepidatious about it, because when the Silmarillion finally was released, it kind of got pretty negative reviews. So The Lord of the Rings came out, and then Christopher Tolkien and a fantasy novelist named Guy Gavriel Kay helped compile, edit, and make the Silmarillion into a sort of whole, narrative whole. So the Silmarillion it comes out of two major interests that Tolkien had. One is mythology, of course. He was very interested in Beowulf. He was also very interested in the Finnish epic poem, the Kalevala. And he was also very interested in languages and how languages develop. And so the way that the Silmarillion kind of came about was that Tolkien, in his spare time, started to invent languages. And a lot of these languages that the elves end up speaking actually were somewhat based on Finnish, because Tolkien learned Finnish to read the Kalevala. And so he decided that he was going to create a history for these languages and of people to speak them, and so this is where we get the Silmarillion. Or at least this first version, which would be revised many times throughout his life. And in fact, around the time he died, Tolkien was planning to revise it again in like a substantial way. He was planning to revise it and make it substantially different in terms of just the cosmology of the world. The first big part of the Silmarillion, the world is flat, actually, and the sun and moon revolve around it. So we have these sort of archaic, cosmology, and he was planning to rewrite the Silmarillion and sort of change all that and make it in line with sort of modern science. But he never got to doing it, so this is what we have. So yeah, the Silmarillion is a difficult book. Let me take a sip of my coffee first. So, Silmarillion is a difficult book, and I kind of tried to come up with a few reasons why it's difficult. The first I thought of was that first off, there's the prose, which is much different from The Lord of the Rings, very reminiscent of the King James Bible, very beautiful, but also kind of archaic, and therefore hard to understand sometimes, because sometimes he uses archaic words as well as archaic diction, and so that can make it, hard to comprehend what he's even trying to say for a modern reader. I certainly had that difficulty when I was first reading. And another one is that a lot of this book, a lot of the first part of this book, a lot of the part of the book that Elena and I read for today, reads a lot more like a history book than a novel. There, in this first part of the book, up to chapter 7, which is what we read for today, there are a lot of characters who kind of appear for a few pages and then just disappear. There are some characters who won't come to play a bigger part till later in the Silmarillion. And it doesn't help that each of these characters is given like 2 or 3 names. So a lot of readers will come into this trying to remember all of these names. And it focuses on these big sort of macro level events rather than on sort of the personal drama at any point in this first stage of the Silmarillion. It's very focused on just setting the stage for the main event of the Silmarillion, which is going to be more sort of up close and personal, so to speak. But still, this first part of the Silmarillion is a bit of a wall to get past. And another thing is that not only does this book read like a work of history, it also kind of reads like one of those old epic poems. Sorry about that. It kind of reads like one of these old epic poems, like the Iliad. When Homer composed the Iliad, he wasn't bringing you up to speed on the people who were involved or the events. He was basically confident that you, the reader, were knowledgeable about the Trojan War, that you basically knew what happened, and so he wasn't interested in giving you any much exposition. And so he just kind of thrust you into this world of the Trojan War. And Tolkien does do exposition, I think, but I also think that it is still written throughout in a way that does kind of assume that you, the reader, sort of know the stories, because it even mentions at some point that even the narrator at one point even mentions, like, oh, this story, everyone knows it through song and stories, and it's just talking about one minor episode in Silmarillion, but still, I think that's indicative of what would be expected of the reader in this. And so I almost feel like it's kind of good to know a bit of what happens in the Silmarillion before going into reading it. And then I mentioned that everyone has 2 or 3 names, and often, sometimes, different characters will call a character by a different name. That doesn't happen that often, but it does kind of intimidate the reader, I think. You go along thinking, am I supposed to remember all 3 of these names? And, you know, that on that point, it leads me into the advice that Elena gave, which I think is the best advice for reading the Silmarillion, which is just to read. Just kind of push forward. If you don't get the names, then that's absolutely fine. You don't need to know most of the names. You just need to know the one name by which a certain character is generally known. And also there is an index of names in the back of the Silmarillion. So there's just the names and the what that name is and what that name means actually too in the language. So those are the main difficulties of the Silmarillion, and so yeah, it is a hard book, but like Elena said, just read if you're going to read it. So anyway, the first section of the Silmarillion is what Elena and I read for today is the Ainulindale, the creation story of this world of Arda, which is what Tolkien's world is called. There's the Valaquenta, which is an account of the Valar, whose name, the Valar, translates to the powers of the world. They're kind of roughly analogous to the Greek pantheon, sort of. That's a very rough approximation, but I think that is a good way to understand how they function. And then chapters 1 through 7. So the Ainulindale is, to me, the Ainulindale is endlessly fascinating. So the way we begin here is we have Iluvatar, who is essentially the monotheistic god of Tolkien's universe. And around Iluvatar are these beings, these spirits or angels, if you will, called the Ainur. And when we first open up, the Ainur are all making music. Each one, it says that they sing like unto harps and lutes. So the music isn't exactly them singing. And it's also not exactly them singing because they don't exactly have like physical being like us. They're sort of these abstract entities that would be beyond the comprehension of a human mind. So when we refer to music, it's kind of a metaphor for us with our tiny human brains to understand what's happening here. So these Ainur are singing, and you see the cat there. So these Ainur are singing, and but each one is singing alone. So imagine an orchestra where each player is playing their own piece of music by themselves. So this isn't really creating any comprehensible piece or symphony of any sort. And after a while of this, Iluvatar kind of settles everyone down and says, "Okay, we're gonna play in harmony now." And so this great music, this great symphony begins. And this is the music of the Ainur, which is what Ainulindale translates as. And it's through this music that the stage is set for the creation of Tolkien's universe. So this music doesn't actually create the world, but it does sort of roughly set the course for history. And this is one of the interesting things about Tolkien's sort of worldview that he imparts to Arda, is that there seems to be a sort of almost like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle, like that's the events of history are roughly set out, but there's always sort of wiggle room for variation, for unexpected things to happen. And so that I see that as kind of Tolkien's view on free will, that maybe history is sort of set, but we have all humans and all, in this case, elves and others, have the ability to choose, are responsible for their choices, because there always is that wiggle room there. But so, right in this music we see the main conflict of the whole Silmarillion start to develop, which is that Melkor, who is the most powerful, most intelligent, most glorious of all the Ainur, decides that he kind of wants to be head honcho. Kind of like Satan from Paradise Lost. And so he kind of starts to create a music, a harmony, or a melody that is dissonant with what the rest of the Ainur are doing. And he gets some Ainur to join him, too. So there are these two musics, and obviously you can see the sort of interplay of good and evil there. And throughout the course of the music of the Ainur, it's emphasized that this dissonant piece of music that Melkor is creating only actually ends up serving the greater good of the whole piece of music. And that is sort of another big part of the worldview that Tolkien imparts to this world, which is that the evil of Melkor, Melkor will become Morgoth, who is the sort of major Dark Lord of the Silmarillion, and is also Sauron, who you might know, is one of his most high-ranking lieutenants. And so Melkor, everything he does, according to Tolkien, all the evil he brings about will only end up serving the purposes of Iluvatar, of God, essentially. And another, tied in with that, is this idea that's first put forth in the Ainulindale, which is that it's the sorrow and the suffering that is expressed in the music of the Ainur from which it primarily gets its beauty, which kind of implies that Tolkien thinks that sorrow and suffering are the primary sources of beauty in life. So that is sort of why Melkor's undertakings will only end up serving Iluvatar's purposes, because all the pain and suffering and sorrow he brings about will only serve to make Iluvatar's project more glorious and beautiful. Now, that's a very interesting worldview. It might be one I take a bit of issue with because of its implications about suffering, but it's still interesting, and it's still a big part of, I think, Tolkien's worldview. So yeah, at the end of the Ainulindale, the music ends, and the Ainur are given this vision of what the world will look like. And a lot of them, not all of them, think, "Wow, that looks gorgeous. I want to go and live there because that looks cool." And so Iluvatar says, "Okay, so those of you who want to can go forth and help to create this world. Those of you who don't want to can stay here with me." And that again, I think, emphasizes that Tolkien does believe in free will, that the Ainur have the choice to go into Arda, into this world, or not. And those who go into Arda, into the world that has been created, are now called Valar, or Maiar. So Valar are kind of like the 12 Olympians of the Greek pantheon, like the head honchos of the Greek pantheon. The Maiar are kind of those lesser Greek gods that you probably never heard of. Like Thetis would be a Maiar, I guess, the mother of Achilles, because she's kind of a minor goddess who doesn't do that much, whereas Zeus would be a Valar, I guess. So these Ainur who go down into Arda are Valar, and of course Melkor sees Arda and says, "I want to rule over that, I want to make it all serve me," and also what everyone sees in this vision is the children of Iluvatar, who are the elves and the humans. And eventually the dwarves will come about, but they come about by a bit of an accident and are kind of what are called the children of Iluvatar's adoption. I won't go too in depth to that, just to keep this relatively simple. So when the Valar and Melkor's followers go down into Arda, the first thing that happens is there's this big war. Essentially, when they first go down, the landmass of Arda is this symmetrical, nice piece of land. But this war kind of creates the world as we know it. There's this great passage that I love where it says, when the Valar raised mountains, Melkor threw them down. When the Valar dug canyons, Melkor filled them in. When the Valar created rivers, Melkor redirected them. So this is how the world gets created. And again, this goes back to that idea that Melkor's malicious intent will only ever end up serving the greater good, in a certain sense, because there's sort of a little anecdote where one of the Valar, who loves water, is so sad and depressed kind of about what Melkor is doing. But then he realizes that it's Melkor who first created the cold, and thus it's Melkor who first created the snowflake, and snow is very beautiful. So, yeah, anyway, that's the Ainulindale. And then after that is the Valaquenta, which isn't really very interesting in a narrative sense. It's a description of all the different Valar. There are 14 Valar, including Melkor, and then there's a few Maiar that it talks about too. And one of the Maiar that it mentions is a guy named Olorin, who will one day, he stays with the Valar kind of chilling out for most of history, but then eventually he will go to Middle-earth to help the peoples there fight Sauron, and he will get the nickname Gandalf. So right here, in like the first 30 pages of the Silmarillion, we see Gandalf, essentially, even though he doesn't do anything and doesn't play a part at all in the rest of the Silmarillion. And by the way, that reminds me, I should mention, there are two main continents in Arda. One is called Aman, and one is called Middle-earth. So Aman is where the Valar live, and it's kind of this sort of blissful realm where everything is wonderful, and it's like eternal life and all this stuff. And then there's Middle-earth, where everything else happens, where all the interesting things happen, essentially. So I feel like I should mention that. So Olorin lives over in Aman for most of the Silmarillion. He's just kind of there, chilling out, not doing much. So yeah, then we get into the main part of the Silmarillion, which is the Quenta Silmarillion. And this first part we're focusing on today um, is what I mentioned about how a lot of the Silmarillion reads like a history book. A lot of this is very sort of broad, overarching. There aren't many characters who you can connect with here, and so this is probably, after the Valaquenta can be kind of a wall that people hit, I think, because it's so boring. But these first 7 chapters are also a challenge to get through, just in terms of not getting bored. But the most important things that happen, the elves are created, of course. And what happens is, after the elves are created, the thing that happened was that after that first war, Melkor wasn't captured. He was still sort of at large in Middle-earth. And so when the elves came to life in Middle-earth, the Valar realized it and said they need to go save them. So they go to Middle-earth and have another war with Melkor to keep the elves safe. And then they decide that they're going to bring the elves back with them to Aman to be safe, basically. And so the elves go to Aman with them, and there in Aman, 2 major things happen. Melkor is imprisoned in Aman. Melkor is captured and imprisoned for a length of 3 ages, and it's never specified what 3 ages means, but that's what happens. And Feanor is born. So there are 3 major divisions of the elves, but the only one that's really important to the Silmarillion is the Noldor, because it's from the Noldor that Feanor is born. And Feanor, of all the elves, is well, maybe not the biggest. He might be tied for the biggest asshole among the elves. He really is just not a pleasant guy. He's born, and he is just great in every way. He is tall and handsome and smart and picks up skills like nobody else, and just so talented, but just not a very nice guy. Really full of himself, really prideful, really spiteful. He's the first elf to use weapons, to use a weapon, and threatens his own half-brother. He's just not a great guy. Well, he does basically do everything that sets the interesting events of the Silmarillion in motion, and what he does is he creates 3 jewels, and these jewels are called the Silmarils, hence the name the Silmarillion. And so what he does to create these jewels is, at the time the elves first come to Aman, rather than having a sun or a moon, there are 2 big trees that are sort of lit up. So there's Telperion, and then there's Laurelin. And Telperion is the tree of silver light, and Laurelin is the tree of golden light. So you can see how Telperion will become the moon, Laurelin will become the sun. But what we learn about these trees is that they drip this dew, and this dew is basically liquid light. And so Feanor uses it to create these jewels, these 3 jewels. And so it makes, for one thing, it makes the jewels uncommonly gorgeous, and it makes everyone covet them. You might recognize that sort of coveting of an object from The Lord of the Rings. And also it means that they are, when the trees, spoiler alert, are eventually destroyed, they are the last objects in the world that contain the light of those trees. And so they become very important. And the other thing that's important about them is that when Melkor serves out his sentence and is released, because when Melkor serves out his sentence, he is sort of given a second chance to redeem himself and show that he's changed his ways. So he's released. When he's released, he starts to really want the Silmarils. And his scheme to get the Silmarils is kind of what drives the whole rest of the drama here. And so Melkor, once he's released, he obviously has free reign to go anywhere in Aman. And he starts to whisper in Feanor's ear, and in the ears of the elf. Well, I guess he's probably not whispering, but anyway, you get the idea. About the Valar, telling them all of these suspicious things about the Valar, that the Valar have done. And it's very interesting to see the way Melkor lies, because he's sort of the epitome of that idea that the best liars tell the truth most of the time. Because he does things like tell Feanor and the elves about the coming of humans, because humans haven't emerged yet. They won't emerge for a while. And he says, well, why haven't the Valar told you that humans are coming? Don't you think that maybe they took you out of Middle-earth so that humans could rule over Middle-earth instead of you? And he tells them things like this to sort of poison their minds against the Valar. And so he, in that way, reminds me a lot of Iago, which I thought was a very interesting thing to notice on this reading. And certainly Tolkien had he had a classical education. He would have been familiar with Shakespeare, so it would stand to reason that Melkor might be influenced by Iago. So I thought that was interesting, and basically, at the end of chapter 7, we have the creation of the Silmarils, and that is basically where we end here. The only other major important thing that happens in this part that is worth mentioning is that Thingol, another elf, who, when the elves were being brought to Aman, decided to stay behind. He kind of found his own little kingdom in Middle-earth, with a bunch of elves who also decided to stay. And he's joined by a Maya named Melian, who kind of is surrounded by nightingales, loves to sing, and is just basically a glorious being. So they get married and have their own little kingdom in Middle-earth, and they will become very important later on. So yeah, that is this first part of the Silmarillion. I hope it was comprehensible. I had a lot of fun putting this video together, and I'm looking forward to the second video. So anyway, thank you for watching, everyone. Bye!